So for the Fante, it was a matter of going to the market on the northern edge, like Asin Manso, Asin Praso, those borderlands between Fante and Asante, buying captives from Asante merchants and then bringing them to the coast and selling them to Europeans.
How can I not be happy all day? I'm from the streets of Africa. If it was speakers in my mind, I bet it would sound like whoa, whoa, whoa.
So this one is about your book, the book you've written, the Fante and then the transatlantic slave trade. So what really inspired you to write that book?
So the book, it's again kind of a long story, but before I came to Ghana, I took a class at Northwestern with a professor named Ivor Wilkes, who was kind of a well-known professor of Asante. And so I was very excited about Asante. I was going to go to Kumasi and try to see the Golden Stool and Asante Gold and all this. But I ended up spending most of my time in Accra, and I took a history class about Fante history, and then of course traveled to Cape Coast and Elmina, and so I became interested in the people who live around the castle at Cape Coast and around the castle at Elmina. Those are the Fante. And when I tried to find books and things, when I went back to the U.S., there wasn't a lot of information about the Fante. Everything was written about Asante, Asante Gold, Asante Kingdom, Asante Hini. So I did my research on the Fante, and the one professor I had, Professor Finn, wrote about Fante. So his was the one main book that I had to use, and then I did my own research and found out that, of course, the Fante were there when the slave trade was going on, just like they are there now, and they had the chiefs had a relationship with the Europeans in the forts. They collected rent from them. They were able to set some of the terms of trade. But I didn't set out to write about the slave trade. I was more interested in these people on the coast and why hasn't their history been written? And when I got into it, I was interested in the gold trade.
So the Fante people are the people around the Cape Coast?
Yeah, all along the coast, from the very western part of the central region all the way up to Winneba, close to Accra. Yeah, it's all Fante. So what's the history of the coast? And there was a period when they were mostly trading gold. And then when the slave trade became more profitable for Europeans, that's what the Europeans and Americans wanted to buy as human captives. So, the Fante were the brokers, they were the middlemen. Most of the capturing of people was happening further inland. The Asante would attack or conquer this people or that group of people, but then they would sell the captives to Fantes, who would turn around and sell them to the slave ships.
I see.
Yeah. So it's, my curiosity led me to kind of a horrible place. But I think it's a story that's important to tell. So that's the book.
That's the book, So I skimmed through the book and I think I came across some, I think there are chapters also online. So there's one chapter that talks about selling the gold and then selling the captives. Mm-hmm. Is that a chapter in the book? Mm-hmm. Like, will you want to give a summary of what that is?
Well, basically, it's setting the stage for what the book is about. Mm-hmm. So, of course, the first Europeans to come were Portuguese in the 1450s, I think. Yeah. They first set up Elmina.
I see.
The Portuguese kept coming and getting gold for a long time, into the 1500s, and then in the 1600s, other Europeans came also for gold. The English, the Dutch, the French, the Swedes. There was a German trading post. So that's most of those forts were built in the 1650s to 1680s time period for the gold trade. But on the other side of the Atlantic, the Dutch and the English and the French and the Danish were setting up sugar plantations. And they started wanting to purchase captive Africans to work on their sugar plantations. So Ghana remained a gold trading site for a long time after other places in Africa had started selling captive people. But eventually Ghana became part of the slave trading coast. Yeah.
Well, it first started with the coal.
With the gold.
And then later, as all African countries were moving and selling their captives, then Ghana also get carried away. I mean, not necessarily carried away, but develop into.
Yeah, because for the European and American traders, it came to a point where they could make more money buying captives and selling them in Jamaica or wherever than they could get from buying gold.
Oh, yeah.
So it's all about the economic aspect.
Oh, I got you.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Interesting. Yeah. So there's another part that talks about the Fante land in the Atlantic Wall. You want to talk a bit about that one too?
Sure.
Yeah.
So that chapter really is trying to explain how that part of the coast of Ghana where the Fante lived was part of this community of people that we talk about in academic studies as the Atlantic world or the Atlantic community. And really what it means is that the port towns, Liverpool and Nantes and New York and Charleston and Kingston and Rio, all of these port towns around the Atlantic Ocean were connected by the ships going back and forth, but also the crews of those ships ended up being from all of those places. And the people who lived in the ports themselves sort of had a shared knowledge of the prices of things that were bought and sold around the Atlantic, the Portuguese language, which was sort of the lingua franca of the Atlantic world for a long time. So they were influenced by each other because they were all connected by trade. So it's a way of showing that it's not just that Africa, I'm not just telling a story about Africa as a place that's separated from the world, but this particular place in Africa and much of the West African coast, especially in the 18th century, was changing in ways that reflected broader patterns that extend all the way to North America and South America and Europe. in terms of the kinds of cotton cloth and rum and tobacco and people who are moving around and sharing news, sharing information, buying and selling things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. So there's another one you said, a new form of government. Yeah, there's another part. There's another chapter that talks about the new form of government. Was it referring to the government of Ghana or like which government are you referring to here?
It's so that chapter is about the government of the Fante.
Okay.
One of the things that you notice if you study pre-colonial Ghana is Asante is very much a centralized kingdom. There's one person, the Asante king or the Asante king, who's in charge, and he has his people under him, and then there are the different provinces around him. The Ga also had one ruler, but there are other areas that were not so centralized, and Fante is one of them. So there were several different Fante chiefs who all sort of seem to share power. So what I try to explain is how they were coordinated amongst themselves. I call it a coalition form of government. Which they formed primarily so that they could. Did it stop?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So what I'm arguing is there was the Fante did not have a kingdom. There was no king.
Okay.
Rather, there were several main chiefs who met on a regular basis and sort of decided amongst themselves. If they were going to create a trade embargo, if they were going to go to war against Asante, they made those important decisions as a group. And then otherwise they sort of governed their own separate parts of Fante on their own. So it was a decentralized form of government.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And that chapter just sort of tries to explain what that looked like. And who the chiefs were and so forth.
So when they had like a decentralized form of government, how does that played in the slave trade? Was it like a cool system or like an easy way that they can get the slaves that they want to sell to the masters, or was it I don't know, how does it really contribute?
So the coalition formed around 1750s or so. By that time, most of the captives who were being sold were coming from either Ashanti region or beyond.
Oh, okay.
So for the Fante, it was a matter of going to the market on the northern edge, like Asin Manso, Asin Praso, those borderlands between Fante and Asante, buying captives from Asante merchants, and then bringing them to the coast and selling them to Europeans.
So the Fante assimilated with the white people in a way. So they are more like
they traded with them.
Oh, they traded with them.
They traded with them.
So there are a lot of Fantes who were taken as slaves from Ghana.
There were some.
But okay, this is an interesting point. So the Fantes at a certain point were trading with the white people at the coast by taking other tribesmen, let's say the Asantes or other people from the inner lands.
The Fantes were mostly buying them at markets and then selling them at other markets.
Oh, interesting.
So the process by which freeborn people were becoming captives, that was mostly happening in wars by the Asante in order to conquer places. And then once the Asante had conquered a territory, they required annual tribute payments. And the tribute payment was in the form of captives.
Captives.
So each region under the Asante king has to provide, let's say, 300 captives, just a random number, every year. And so those people have to figure out, are they going to provide 300 captives from amongst themselves, or are they also going to raid even more distant areas?
I got you.
Also, some of the captives were people who had been accused of a crime. If you committed adultery, they might make you a slave. If they thought you were a witch, they might make you a slave. If you owe a large debt and you can't pay it, you might become a slave. So Fante, they could happen to anybody. A Fante, an Asante, a Dagomba, whatever. But the largest number were taken when Asante would invade with their huge army, take all of the prisoners of war, and then bring them back to Kumasi and then send them south to the coast.
I guess.
So the Fantes themselves were guilty, if you want to say that, of buying captives at the market, selling them to the white man.
That's what is interesting.
And occasionally, maybe, there were some Fantes who would kidnap someone or something. But mostly the Fantes were business people. They were buying here and selling them. Yeah.
And so did they see anything wrong with that or not?
That's the question. I think we have to assume, there's slavery now. There's slave trading now.
Yes.
In the U.S., there are tens of thousands of people, mostly women and children, trafficked, bought and sold every year.
Yeah.
So do people have a problem with that? Yes, I have a problem with that.
Right.
Am I doing anything personally to stop it? No.
Yeah.
I think, a certain small number of Fantes were involved in this. And everybody else was just farming, fishing, going about their business. I mean, if you went to the beach and watched what was happening, you would see that people were being sold. But these are people who are from a distant place, probably.
Not kind of blood related.
Maybe speak a different language. Maybe look different from you. So, and you're not personally involved, so you just go about your business. That's what humans do, right?
Yeah, I know.
There were Europeans and Americans who had a problem with it, but they turned the other way.
I got you. So the other one on my list is making the Fante culture. So we want to talk about that.
Okay. That chapter is trying to explain how did Fante as a society change during this period, or you might say what aspects of Fante culture originated during this time when there was a lot of violence, a lot of insecurity, and a lot of Europeans around also. So I read about the Fante, was sometimes called the Fante National Shrine of Nananumpo. The chiefs would consult the shrine before making important decisions, and the shrine was also believed to provide some protection to the Fantes when they would go to war and so forth.
Yeah.
So I argue that shrine became more important than it had been before because of all the war and the possibilities of invasion and raiding and so forth. And then I also write about the Asafo companies.
Okay.
I think, and I think the evidence supports my belief that the Asafo companies that we know today really came into their present form during the period of the slave trade. They were militia groups that really included all of the men all of the able-bodied young men and older men. And I think there was a necessity for militia groups because people needed to be protected.
Right.
So it was a way of organizing people for defense, primarily.
I got you.
And then, of course, after the slave trade and into the colonial period, they served other purposes, but they maintained their sort of military culture, even if they weren't really fighting so much anymore.
Yeah. I see. So in your view, the Fante culture and then the Asante culture, which of these two really like stand out like globally? Do you think
Oh, nobody knows anything.
about
Nobody's ever heard of the Fante.
Fante? Yeah. Is it because they don't have a lot of historians?
Maybe. And they don't have the gold, and they don't have the king. I mean, the Asante continue to have a king.
Yeah. So their culture died out at a certain point.
No, I mean their culture.
No, I mean like the government. I wanted to say.
Oh, the Fante government.
Yeah.
Yes, like most African societies, I think when they were colonized by the British, that that was the end of their sort of. Well, I mean, there's still Fante chiefs, but they've never had as much power since the colonial period as they did before the colonial period.
I got you.
I mean, that's also true of the Asante, but the Asantehene seems to be more powerful among the Asante than the Fante chiefs
than the
are.
Fante chiefs, yeah, true.
I'm not sure.
Wow, interesting. This is the end of the interview, guys. I'm sure you like the video. Until I come your way next time, enjoy.
Thanks, Melody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.
How can I not be happy all day? I'm from the streets of Africa. If it was speakers in my mind, I bet it would sound like whoa, whoa.